The United Arab Emirates appears to have taken over the island of Socotra. Its troops are in key positions, including the airport. The islanders are staging big protests demanding the soldiers leave. So what does the UAE want, and what's driving its expansion in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hoda Abdelhamid. There is public outrage on the island of Socotra. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the people who live there don't want it to become part of the conflict in Yemen. But on Thursday, the UAE deployed troops to the island, seizing strategic positions. This has angered the Yemeni government of President Rabu Mansour Hadi. It says it wasn't informed of the move. The UAE is part of the Saudi-led coalition fighting Houthi rebels in the country and is a former ally of Hadi, but splits have recently emerged. Mohammed Ado reports.
They're calling for troops from the United Arab Emirates to leave the island of Socotra. The people who live here say there are no Houthi rebels on the island. That means UAE forces have no reason to stay. Emirati soldiers stand up on Thursday, forcing out Yemeni troops and taking over some strategic locations. They say it's part of their operation to back forces loyal to exiled Yemeni President Abdelhamid Mansour Hadi. Socotra is a World Heritage Site known for its unique and pristine natural environment. It's located just off the coast of Somalia with access to major shipping routes. The head of a provincial council in Yemen says the UAE soldiers should leave.
These forces are present in Socotra or Al-Mahra in volumes that can't be understood. There are illegitimate troops in these areas. Are there forces that belong to the Houthis to be fought by the coalition here? The answer is a big no.
Yemen's war pits Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in the north against troops loyal to exiled President Hadi. The UAE is part of a Saudi-led coalition that stepped in 3 years ago to support Hadi, whose power base is in the southern city of Aden. That's where the UAE has been growing its influence, funding and training armed Yemeni groups. Now the UAE is on the island of Socotra. Yemen's Prime Minister says the Emirati deployment there is an assault on Yemen's sovereignty. These protesters agree. They're also worried that what makes the island unique will be destroyed too. Mohammed Ado, Al Jazeera.
The island of Socotra is the latest territory where Emirati troops have been sent as the UAE expands its military presence in the Horn of Africa. They are also deployed elsewhere across mainland Yemen, in Hadramaut, for example, and the coastal city of Aden, which was recently overrun by separatists backed by the UAE. And the Emirates appear to be building an airstrip on Yemen's Perim Island that sits right in the middle of Bab el-Mandeb Strait. On the African side of the Red Sea, the UAE operates the Asab Naval and Air Base in Eritrea, used to support military operations in Yemen. Further south, in Somalia's breakaway region of Somaliland, the UAE is building a military base in the coastal city of Berbera without the approval of the central government there. And in Puntland, another part of Somalia with a self-governing status that is not internationally recognized so far, the UAE is building the port of Bosaso and training the local maritime police force. Time to bring in our guests. Joining us from London, Andreas Krieg, specialist in the GCC and assistant professor at the Defence Studies Department at King's College. And in Brighton, Catherine Shakdam, Middle East commentator and researcher at Bayan Center for Strategic Studies. A warm welcome to both of you. Andreas Krieg, let me start with you. What do you think are the real motive behind the UAE beefing up its presence in the island of Socotra?
Right. There are a variety of different reasons. I think we first of all have to kind of disconnect this current Socotra incident from what happened in the GCC. This is not part of the GCC crisis per se, although the Emiratis have tried to frame it in that way. I think this is part of an ongoing development that we've seen by the United Arab Emirates ongoing since over the last decade, really. They've tried to expand their reach, both militarily and commercially, into the Horn of Africa, which has become an absolutely, and has always been for a very long time, commercially a very interesting and important part. And the control of that area, control of the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, as well as both sides of the Horn of Africa, in East Africa as well as in Yemen, and along the Red Sea coast, is absolutely detrimental and important for the delivery of goods from east to west. So I'm talking about East Asia towards Europe, but also it's very important for the region itself, for Ethiopia, Eritrea. These countries, and Kenya as well, are up and coming. There's a lot of investments being made, and they have used the ports on this part of, obviously, an East African coast. And it was always important for the UAE, who have marketed themselves as a merchant country, to basically control access to these kind of trade routes and ensure that there's some sort of freedom of navigation in that area. And they've started already in the late 2000s. Dubai Port World, for example, has invested along the coast. And there's been a couple of incidences in Djibouti, for example, where this Emirati company was kicked out. And the Emiratis started to build alternatives across the coast. So there is a military component to it, which is about controlling, ensuring freedom of navigation. There is one which has to do with ensuring that no weapons will come to Yemen. And there is one much further, which is about placing the Emiratis strategically at the heart of international trade in this part of the world. They want to be not just the primus inter pares, which they are at the moment, arguably, but they want to absolutely be the hegemon in this part of the world. And if you look at the way they have strategically placed these different ports and military bases, this is the only explanation that there is. And I think Socotra fits very nicely. Socotra is much closer to the East African coast, very much closer to Somaliland, where already the Emiratis are very much bogged down. In all these areas, the Emiratis have used surrogates and built surrogates to export and help building their strategy. And Socotra very nicely fits in if you look at it geographically. And it's much further away from Yemen. And it is so far offshore that it provides you with a sort of aircraft carrier capability as a guard for the access to the Bab al-Mandeb Strait. So it's very strategic. It allows you to control trade, and it does so under the umbrella of a wider operation against the Houthis, which is obviously nonsense if you look at this kind of argument.
Well, Catherine Chapman, now the UAE says that its purpose in Socotra has been distorted, mainly by the likes of the Muslim Brotherhood, Qatar, Turkey. Actually, the U.S. State Minister for Foreign Affairs, Anwar Gargash, on social media talked about historic links between the people of the UAE and Socotra. What are those links, and how come all of a sudden they become important now?
Well, I think, to be completely fair with you, I think that what we see is growing tension in between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And it's manifesting in Socotra, where there is, I think, a race, number one, as your guest mentioned, in London, for control of the waterways for very obvious geopolitical reason. And then, of course, I think that given, certain developments over the past few months and even few years within the GCC, I think it stands to reason for the UAE to be a little bit wary of what's coming out of Riyadh in terms of policies and the decisions that are being made, when it comes to certain alliances or even friendships. And so I do see, this effort in Socotra, yes, it has been blown out of proportion because it has been politically played out in that, the government of Hadi is not being very genuine, if I'm completely honest, I think, in towards their position towards the UAE, because only just a few years ago, back in 2014, for example, Hadi was quite happy to welcome the UAE, not just in Socotra, but as well in Aden, in the seaport of Aden. So I think that what we see is just, growing tension in between, as you mentioned, certain powers within maybe the Middle East. But I don't think it has anything to do with the Muslim Brotherhood per se. I think it has everything to do with Saudi Arabia, however, and how the UAE is trying to break away, I think, from this crown hegemon that is Saudi Arabia right now in the region, and they're trying to be a bit more independent. And if we recall what happened with Qatar, trying to do the same thing, to try to actually pursue independent policies and trying to assert itself as an independent power within the region, and the international community. I think that Saudi Arabia is kind of running a little, a campaign against the UAE, trying to misportray the UAE's intention, or maybe trying to utilize this to its benefit and trying to get things out of context. I'm not justifying the position of the UAE in Socotra. I'm just trying to give some context to it and the reason why today it's being criticized. I think there's a great degree of hypocrisy, on the part of Hadi and Saudi Arabia. As for the UAE, I mean, we have to understand that as a sovereign nation, they're going to do what they see as in their best interest. And I think that controlling Socotra, the seaport of Aden, and having a very heavy presence in the Horn of Africa makes sense from a UAE perspective.
Yeah, but, one says blown out of proportion, distorted, very nice words, but you do have 60,000 residents on the island, and many of them went down to the street denouncing what they see as an Emirati occupation of the island. Is it an occupation in your view, Catherine?
Yes, I think it is. I mean, we have to remember that Yemen is a sovereign nation, and so its people have rights. And if a nation is in fact imposing, whether it's military or otherwise, but its presence is forced onto a nation, then yes, it is not just an occupation, but it's actually an act of war, technically speaking. And so, I'm not justifying the UAE at all, because I do think that at the end of the day, the people of Yemen have a right to decide, who's allowed in their, within their territory and their borders. And I think that the UAE actually broke the law, international law here. And so, the matter would need to be discussed. But the problem that I have is that, this particular occupation is not talked about from a Yemeni perspective, but rather from, a political perspective, whereas, the Saudi are using this as a munition in a way against the UAE. And I think we need to consider that it might be a proxy here, that, there are tensions growing in between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and Socotra is collateral damage, really. But I think it falls within a more regional kind of race to control, this particular region here, because for obvious reasons, commercial reasons, military reasons, and of course, there's Bab el-Mandab, and the fact that, it's the world oil route, and it's very important. And whoever will control it will control not the fate of the world, but will bear quite heavy on international relations.
We'll go into what's happening within the Saudi-led coalition in a moment, but I want to put the same question to you, Andreas Krieg. Do you view the presence of Emirati soldiers in Socotra as an occupation? And also, in the long run, I mean, the UAE is a rich country, but relatively small, militarily not very strong. Is it sustainable?
Well, I mean, is the entire strategy of the Emiratis sustainable at the moment? I think they're punching way above their weight. They have tried to translate their soft power increasingly into hard power. We have to say the Emirati military is probably the most effective one in the region at the moment, considering its size, also in comparison to the Saudis. And that's why there is this kind of dependency coming along, where the Saudis knew in 2015 that they couldn't run this war without Emirati support. The Emirati were absolutely crucial in this, but the Emiratis didn't see at the time in 2015 the Houthis as an existential threat to their security, but it was an existential threat to Saudi security. So the Saudis needed to provide the Emiratis with some sort of goodie to make them come along. And it became quite clear early on, and at that time I was still working for the Qatari military, and I was liaising on a daily basis with Saudi military as well. We could see quite quickly already in 2015 that the Emiratis were pushing their own agenda in the south, trying to secure their access to the Red Sea, and they kind of refrained from getting bogged down or dragged into the war in the north, which is a separate conflict from what was going on in the south. And what we've seen, and this is very important to bear in mind here, is there is a larger pattern emerging. The Emiratis have tried to use tribal links and also secessionist movements within the country, like the Iraq al-Janubi in the south of Yemen, and formed this new surrogate in the south that has moved against the Hadi government. Now, the problem with that is that the Hadi government invited the coalition, which was Saudi-led, to come to Yemen in 2015. Now, the Emiratis came along on this invitation, and they were invited to come along. There is a debate to be had whether the Hadi government had the authority to invite anybody along under international law, considering how divided the country was. But the Emiratis came along under the invitation of the Hadi government as the internationally recognized government, and under the premise that they were fighting the Houthis and terrorism in the country. This Socotra Island has nothing to do with that invitation, it has nothing to do with that kind of policy, and has nothing to do with that objective. So it's something that cannot be argued and justified under international law, saying that there is a justification to come along. And what the Emiratis are doing now very much moves against the Saudi interests. The fact that Saudis were on the island a couple of days ago trying to reconcile with local tribal leaders, for example, suggests that the Saudis are very concerned that the Emiratis are pursuing their interest in Yemen at the expense of the Saudis, which in 2015, 2016, the Saudis were okay that the Emiratis were pursuing their own national interests as long as they were serving the overall coalition interest. Where we stand today, it seems that the Emiratis have achieved their objective in the south, and they are not that inclined to help on the massive scale the Saudis out as they might have done in earlier years.
And that really puts into question this Saudi-led coalition. Many would argue it hasn't achieved much so far in the conflict in Yemen. And where is it going from there? So now you have the two major countries participating in that coalition, Catherine. Saudi is still trying to support President Hadi. The UAE seems to have dropped him, basically. I mean, having your own troops and sort of keeping hostage for a while or not allowing a prime minister of a country to leave an island is quite a bold move. So how will all of this impact the main conflict that is going on in the mainland?
Well, I think it's going to definitely have a great impact in the sense that, as you mentioned before, Yemen is broken up, along so many lines. So you have the north and the south, if you really want to simplify things. And then, of course, the UAE is bearing heavy in the south. And the Saudi have relied quite heavily, if not completely, on the UAE to be running, the southern campaign, if you want to call it that. So this is going to complicate things because the Saudi now cannot count on the UAE to actually toe their own line. They're going to be running their own agenda. They're going to be running their own policies in Yemen, possibly even backing or even brokering their own peace if you really want to take it a step further. And I think that it's going to put the Saudi in a very difficult situation because they don't really have any backup or even any real say in terms of, Hadi's popularity in Yemen, which is almost non-existent. So they're backing, not just they're backing the wrong horse. If I can put it that way, with Hadi. So it's going to make things very difficult because not only do they have to maybe look somewhere else to try to find, another ally to kind of, re-galvanize their troops and their position in the war in Yemen, bearing in mind that the UAE might actually completely break away from this and actually run their own policy parallel to that of Saudi Arabia. And they might actually, their agenda might actually clash in terms of what is it that they want to see achieve. And I think that the UAE is actually more invested in brokering a peace with Yemen because, as you said, they don't look upon the resistance movement in Yemen, the Houthi, as an existential threat to their own government. And I think that there's a common interest in running against the Muslim Brotherhood when it comes to the Houthi and the UAE. So they might have more common ground than, maybe the Houthi and the Saudis. And so it will make things quite interesting to see how a peace might actually brokered away from Saudi Arabia, even though the Saudi are the ones who declare war on Yemen, essentially, back in 2015. So I think it's putting the Saudi on the wrong foot here. But I'm not surprised because from the very beginning of this war, and even more so lately, I think that Riyadh's policy have been a little bit erratic, and they're not trying to see the bigger picture or trying to understand the consequences that their choices will have short-term, mid-term, and even longer-term. And I think that the UAE has a better understanding of this, of the dynamic, whether geopolitical, even social within Yemen, the Horn of Africa, and the greater region as a whole. So I think it's going to be quite interesting because I think what you see today is actually a growing rivalry in between Riyadh and Abu Dhabi. And I think that Abu Dhabi will have the upper hand. And yes, it is a small country, but, money speaks louder. And today, I think that in terms of military power, how it is exerted and manifested on the ground, the use of mercenary armies is actually quite the way forward now, it seems. So it could be possible that the UAE see, their presence to be, to the use of mercenary armies and maybe to use other technique or other diplomatic tools to exert influence onto a country, which on the long term is actually much more, useful and a bit cleverer than what Riyadh is trying to do at the current moment. So it's definitely very interesting, and it will weigh heavy on Yemen, I believe.
Well, certainly the relations between Saudi Arabia and the Emirates is something that one will have to look closely at in the coming weeks and months. But going back to what you were saying earlier, Andreas Krieg, about all the economic side of the UAE, let's say, expansion or involvement in the Gulf of Aden, Socotra being in the middle of this very important international shipping route. Will actually the Saudis let the whole Gulf be taken over by the Emiratis and they just sit and watch while all this economic potential is just taken away from them? Will they let that slip away from them?
I mean, do the Saudis have a choice is the question. I mean, I wouldn't say that there is a rift developing between Abu Dhabi and Riyadh. It's not a rift per se. There is a grand strategic alliance here, also ideologically. But we have to assert as well that Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince and supposedly new ruler of Saudi Arabia, is very much in a junior role vis-à-vis Mohammed bin Zayed, who is the ruler and crown prince of the United Arab Emirates. The UAE have actually a strategy, and a strategy that they have developed over at least 15 years. Strategic thinking means that you're in there for the long run. You have the ways and the means to secure your strategic objectives, and the Emiratis, for the most part, have actually had that. The Saudis don't have a real strategy. They have some objectives. They have very few means, and they have no ways to actually achieve them. And in that way, they're trapped in this junior role. Also, in that respect, the Saudis are not looking at exercising real power, whether soft or hard power, outside their borders. They've tried in Lebanon and failed. They tried in Qatar and they failed. They're trying in Yemen and they're failing. And I agree with Catherine to a point. The UAE have more strategically invested, similar like Iran does, by the way, invested strategically into the sociopolitics of the southern provinces of Yemen. They have built a movement from the bottom up rather than from the top down. The Saudis, what they usually do is they go into a country, they try to pay one proxy, and then when the proxy doesn't work for them anymore, they pay the opposite side. If you look at the Yemen conflict, Saudi over the years and over the decades have been on all sides of the conflict, whether with royalists or Republicans, whether with southerners or northerners, whether with tribal forces, with jihadists, Salafists, you name it, even with the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Emiratis have chosen a side, and they're building this side, and they're doing it somewhat, as I said, at the expense of the Saudis. And also the Emiratis have realized that the Gulf, the Persian Gulf, is less important in the long run than the Indian Ocean and Bab el-Mandab. In the long run, the Persian Gulf, particularly because we see a withdrawal from the West, we see a withdrawal of some of the oil and gas interests in the Gulf. I think if you look purely at the trade routes, I would say that the Indian Ocean, more generally, not just Bab el-Mandab, but the extensive region of the Indian Ocean is becoming increasingly important as Pakistan is rising and India is rising, China is rising. So we have this pivot towards Asia overall in terms of geopolitics. So it's very important for the Emiratis to be part of this, and they realize this. All smaller GCC countries, by the way, do this. The Qataris as well, they're investing very heavily in East Asia because that's where the future is. Saudi Arabia somewhat has missed this train. The Saudis have bought into America, and they continue to buy into America, and they don't realize that actually in front of their doorstep there's a lot more to be done. But they, as I said, the Saudis have no strategy, and they're being constantly outmaneuvered by those powers that have a strategy.
Certainly, Socotra is a place many will be looking at closely and wondering if at some point it will fall into this Yemeni conflict or not. But we have reached the end of this conversation, so it will be for another time. Thank you to our guests, Andreas Krieg and Catherine Shakdam, and thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJE Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJE Inside Story. From me, Hoda Abdelhamid, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.